Today I'm going to share with you my favorite tips and tricks for transplanting baby plants out into the garden. Let's go. Hey friends, it's Kendall, your joyful farmer. I'm here with you today to share with you some tips and tricks for planting out your baby transplants. These are some things that I really wish someone would have told me years ago before I started gardening. Tip number one might be the most important thing that you can do for your baby seedlings, and that is soil prep. Your baby plants were likely growing in a soilless medium that was nice and fluffy and aerated, and they had easy access to nutrients and oxygen. And when you transplant them into soil, you're gonna find that they're gonna have some transplant shock. But to reduce that transplant shock, you want your soil to be fluffy as well. A general rule of thumb is if you can reach down and pick up a handful of soil from where you're going to transplant, that's a great sign that your transplants will be able to grow and thrive. If you reach down and you feel something like compacted soil or clay that's really hard to grab with your hand, that's a sign that your baby transplants are gonna have a difficult time growing roots in that soil. And they may become stunted or grow really slowly or have failure to thrive and produce. So if you find that you have clay soil or soil that's very compacted, you're gonna have to decompact it. Some ways that you can do that are over time. You can use a broad fork. You can use cover crops like daikon radish, okra, mustard that can reach their roots down into the soil and help open up that soil and aerate and create soil life. But if you're looking to plant your plants out, say, today or tomorrow, you're gonna need something that's gonna work a little bit quicker to decompact your soil. And you're gonna have to do some cultivating or tilling to amend your soil. Yes, tilling disturbs the microbiome of soil. It's not the ideal way to build up your soil life, but if you're looking to plant quickly and prepare your garden space, that's a way to do it. It's very possible that you till the first year and you never have to till again. When you're tilling or cultivating, you want to incorporate organic matter. This can be anything from compost that you have purchased and brought in, compost that you've made. We use a lot of compost from a trusted source that uses horse manure and wood chips to create a really rich compost. You can also purchase mushroom compost. There are all sorts of different options out there. You can also incorporate other organic matter like ground up leaves or aged manure from chickens, cows, goats, sheep, rabbits. Another thing you can do if you don't have access to a tiller, you can dig out an area that's larger than the root ball of the plant that you're going to be transplanting, and you can prepare and amend that soil and add all the organic matter into that smaller space, also saving you a little bit of cost and time in amending the soil for your plants. But you want to do a really good job of feeding your soil. Tip number two is a pretty simple one. I like to put water in the hole as I'm planting. So as I dig a hole where I'm going to put the transplant, I will just water that hole before I transplant it, and then I'll water it again after. This helps when soil's hydrophobic. It helps to kind of direct the water and be sure that the water is in the rhizome or the area where the roots are going to grow to be sure that it's really ready to receive a plant. Tip number three is if you're planting on a small scale, it can help to leave a slight bowl in the soil where you have your transplant. Especially if you're in an area that doesn't get a lot of rain and you're going to be doing a lot of hand watering, it's really great to be able to concentrate the water and have it directly go to the roots. Sometimes if you have the soil built up around a plant in kind of a mound, you'll find that the water just kind of bounces off and drains away from the plant rather than going to the roots where it's really needed. Tip number four is to fertilize a little bit as you're planting. Feeding phosphorus to your roots is going to give them a little bit of a boost and help to encourage that new growth. I have rock phosphate that this works great for. You can take a teaspoon of rock phosphate and sprinkle it into the hole before you plant. Tip number five is to make sure that your plants are ready for the transition. So your plants should be hardened off before you transplant them in the garden. It's quite a shock to the plant to be transplanted. So you want to make sure that they're hardened off before you put them in the ground. You want to harden them off to the sun, the wind, and the variable temperatures gradually. I like to have a lot of my transplants growing outside or in a greenhouse so that they're adapted to more of those variables before I have to harden them off. If you're transitioning them from indoors to outdoors, you're gonna have to be very careful to make sure that it's a gradual transition. Some things that you can do are putting your transplants into dappled shade for the day. So where there's shade from trees, that works really well. You can also take them from indoors onto a covered patio and first adjust them to the temperatures and the wind before putting them out in the sunlight. You can also cover them partially with a sheet or a row cover to get them ready for transplanting out as well. And if you're impatient like I am, and you know that you've got your seedlings hardened off to at least a couple of the variables, you can transplant and cover them with row cover to protect them from sun and wind. I would cover them for about a week completely just to help them adjust to the temperatures and start to get acclimated to the sunlight. And then for about half a day, I would leave the row cover on. Half a day, I would take it off for about 2 or 3 days, and that will help them adjust to the full sunlight. You can order hoops and row covers from a place like Johnny's, or you can go down to your local farm supply store and look for some 9-gauge wire, and that's really cheap. You can just cut pieces, and those create nice little hoops that you can stick into the ground, and they'll support your plants that way. You can even use sheets, just old bed sheets from your house to cover plants, or any translucent material that's going to block the wind and some of the sunlight. Tip number 6 is to pay attention to the temperature of your soil. Some plants like cooler soil. Some plants do not like cooler soil. Peppers, for example, really like warmer soil. They prefer at least 60-degree soil, and if you plant them in soil that's cooler than that, you risk severe shock and stunting to the plant. It sometimes can stunt your plants for an entire season if you plant them in soil that's too cool. Same with cucumbers. I learned this the hard way a couple of years ago. I planted my cucumbers out a little bit too early. The soil was not yet 60 degrees, and they stunted, and I had to start over for the season. Tip number 7 is to mulch. It always helps to put a couple of inches of mulch on top of the soil surface where you've planted your plants. It helps to reduce weed pressure, as well as help the soil to retain moisture and keep your plants alive and happy. I like to use the aged horse manure compost on top of the soil as a top dressing of compost, but also as a mulch. It works really well for me. And my last tip for you is maybe my favorite tip. If you don't know already, I'm a huge proponent of direct sowing. There are certain crops that you can start indoors and you can transplant out, or you can purchase transplants from the store, but I'll also direct sow some at the time that I transplant them, so I have some built-in succession planting. I'll have these transplants that grow and mature and produce, but then I'll also have direct sown plants right behind them that can fill in the gaps after the first round stops producing. I love to do this with things like squash, cucumber, and watermelon especially, sometimes bush beans or pole beans, and flowers like sunflowers and zinnias. I really like to do this with as well. And a little bonus tip for you, just get out there and try transplanting, have fun with it, enjoy. Don't be afraid to make mistakes, because that's truly how you learn and grow as a gardener. So those are all my tips and tricks. I hope that was helpful for you. Thank you so much for watching. I wish you joy on your gardening journey, and I'll see you next time.